distributions of these different bees. Maybe you can't see it, so I'll tell you the scale at the bottom here is age in days, from 1 out to 28 days. And the foragers ranged from 16 to 28 days, the most elderly bees. The foragers, the food stores were 10 to 19 days old, and then the nurse bees were 1 to 10 days old. So you can see there are really three age groups there, and the foragers are at one end, the food stores in the middle, and the nurse bees at the other end. You might wonder how I get this information. It's not very hard, but it does require setting up an observation hive, and for 28, 30, basically for 30 days, every 3 days, I collect newly emerged bees, 100 of those, and I would collect them, and on the back of each of those 100 bees I've collected on a certain day, I'll put a dot of paint on the thorax of a particular color. And you do that for 30 days, basically 10 times, and then you've got a full range of bees. Not every bee in the hive is labeled with a known age, for a known age, but enough are so that you can then look in the hive and you can see which bees are acting as nurse bees, such as tending the queen, or with their heads down in a cell with brood in it. You can also see you can see which bees are receiving the nectar, as we just saw in the photograph. And that's a food store bee, and then you know its age. And likewise, you can see which bees are coming in with nectar or pollen, and you can read the ages of those. So that's where this information comes from. Now, this is a factory that has to operate under conditions that are a bit different from human factories. Basically, the problem with the honey factory is that it's got an ever-changing supply of its raw material. You can have a honey flow, a nectar flow, and a nectar dearth at any point in between. This is a general problem for any sort of production line process like this. But when humans have that problem, what they do is they buffer it. You have a supply of the raw materials, and you get shipments in, so you never have to deal with running out of a supply. The bees don't have that luxury. They don't control. They can't stockpile nectar. They have to work with what nature provides. So that's a lot of the context in which the mechanisms that we'll be looking at make sense. Here's an example of the kind of boom and bust situation that there is with nectar availability. Has anybody here had a scale hive, a hive on scales, and take data every day or thereabouts? Okay, yeah, great. So this looks probably very familiar to you. This was a scale hive I had in Connecticut, and this is over here it indicates the number of kilograms, basically 2-pound units per day that were collected. And in late April, early May, not much was coming in. Then the dandelions came into bloom. Colonies were gaining up to about almost 4 pounds a day. And there was a dearth. Black locust came into bloom. There was one day when the colony on this scales here gained over 12 pounds in a day, and so forth. And jumps around. Every day is different. And some of that variation is because it gets raining. And there's just nothing available. So that's a big problem for the bees. They're going to have to really make adjustments on days when there's a lot, because on these days, a day like this, they want to mobilize. In fact, if you go through the whole year, there's only, I forgot exactly what the number is, but there's only a few dozen days over the whole summer, really over the whole year, when they make most of their production, their honey production. And so on those days, they want to be able to really mobilize their labor, the necessary labor to gather and process the nectar. So, okay, here's a thought question then. What does a colony need to do on one of these days when suddenly the goldenrod is in bloom, or suddenly the black locust trees are in bloom? There's a nectar flow. There's lots of nectar out there. What's a colony going to have to do to take advantage of that?
Increase foraging.
Increase foraging, yep. Ramp up the number of bees that are engaged in collecting that nectar. What else are they going to have to do?
Clean up storage area.
Yeah, they're going to have to turn up the food store numbers too. Yeah, I like to draw the analogy here between the situation of going into a grocery store when suddenly, and there's a flood, there's a nectar flow of customers to that grocery store. What happens? You come to the checkout line, and if they haven't turned up the number of checkout people, there's going to be a backlog. And do you feel like it's an efficient use of your time to be standing in line, in the checkout line? No. And the bees don't either. So they've got to, as they increase the rate at which bees are coming in, foragers are coming in, needing to be unloaded, they're going to have to turn up the number of bees engaged in food storing to be able to handle that. So that these bees, these returning nectar foragers, aren't walking around, milling around, wasting time, really, trying to find somebody to take their load of nectar. So, yes, they're going to have to do two things. Step one, they're going to have to mobilize more nectar foragers, and secondly, they're going to have to activate more food stores so that this process runs smoothly, so that materials come in and are processed without delays by the foragers. So that's what we're going to do now is look at what do they do to do these two steps. And it's a tricky process. Well, one thing they do is they use the famous waggle dance to increase the number of bees engaged in nectar foraging. Here's a waggle dancer. This is probably familiar to most of you. The dancer walks forward, points in a certain direction. This one, it's basically she's pointing to the left. And as she points to the left, she marks that that's the direction she's indicating by waggling her body. And each of these waggle run motions lasts a fixed period of time, the same period of time. It's about 0.8 of a second. Let's play that again. And you'll notice the other bees, while she does a waggle, and she comes around, waggles, points to the left, comes around. You'll notice all these other bees that are tripping along behind her. And these are bees trying to get her message. Now, you probably notice that bee's not dancing on a comb. This is actually a nest site scout dancing on the surface of a swarm. But I showed this video of the waggle dance because everything's out in the open, you can get a very nice image. But it's the same communication signal used by the foragers. So, to mobilize more nectar foragers, they use the waggle dance. That's part of it. But that's not the whole story. There's another signal that's involved in this process. But just to remind you, before we get to that, I just want to remind you how this waggle dance works. If the bee has found a patch of, let's say it's a bee living in a bee tree here, she's found some flowers over in this direction. To indicate the direction to other bees during her dance, she notes the angle of the flower patch relative to the direction of the sun. In this case, the flowers are 40 degrees to the right of the direction of the sun. And then when she's inside the hive, where she can't see the sun, but she's dancing on a vertical surface, she uses straight up as the reference, the directional reference, akin to using the sun as a directional reference outside the hive. So to indicate the direction to the flowers, she does her waggle motion 40 degrees to the right of straight up, just as the flowers are 40 degrees to the right of the direction of the sun. So the angle of the dance, waggling, relative to straight up indicates the direction relative to the direction of the sun. And then they encode the distance to the flowers by how long each of those waggle runs lasts. The one we watched, each waggle run was about 0.8 of a second, and that means she was indicating to bees that a food source, or actually it was a nest site, about 500 meters away, or 500 meters, that would be about a little over a third of a mile away. Okay, so that's the waggle dance. I mentioned, though, that the waggle dance isn't the whole story. there's also a shaking signal. And I'm going to come back to the shaking signal, but before we leave the waggle dance, I want to share with you the results of a little experiment did some time back, which addressed the question is the waggle dance good at boosting the number of bees working a good nectar source? It had long been known even back in the 1940s how the waggle dance worked, but nobody had ever actually tested just how well it works. Its function was clear. It mobilized more bees to a food source, but we actually hadn't tested just how effective it is. So to do that, I made use of this island off the coast of Maine called Appledore Island. And I used it at a certain time of year. I used it in August. This is a time of year when there's still a few flowers in bloom on the island, but there's very little nectar production on the island. And I went out a summer where it was very, very dry, so there was virtually no nectar production on the island. And what I did is I took out to the island, and there are no honeybees living on this island naturally, normally. So I could take out one colony of bees in a hive. It was in an observation hive. And the other thing I took out to the island, because the island is a portable flower patch. So I could put out for this colony, I could create a treasure hunt for the colony. And it was a treasure, where the treasure I could move around. And so the way this worked is I had the bees on the island, I could take out my portable flower patch, I'll show you a picture of it in a second, and then I could wait to see how long it took for a scout bee to discover the flower patch, and then watch the start of her dancing and see how quickly she brought bees to her discovery. Here's a part of what this portable flower patch looks like. It's a bunch of pots of borage flowers. How many people here grow borage to provide bees with good nectar? The bees love it, as you know. And they actually love these borage flowers especially a lot, because not only were the flowers making nectar, but I had a tiny little syringe, and I could supercharge each blossom with a little extra sugar solution. So this was a really dynamite food source for the bees. So there's a hive here, over on the east side of the island, and there's an assistant stationed at the observation hive. And then the morning of day one, I set up my flower patch. I got up before sunrise. I set out the flowers here, and I waited for the bees. I didn't know when the bee would come. I didn't know if she'd come that day or what. So I sat there by the flowers waiting for a bee to come. And I sat there, actually 120 minutes. No bees, no bees, no bees, no bees for 2 hours. But then, one industrious little worker bee came closer and closer. She was going from flower to flower. Not my flowers, the wild flowers, but they were producing no rewards for her. So she kept coming. And I waited, and I hope she finds these borage flowers. And of course she did, because they were so conspicuous. And once she got her tongue into those, and into the sugar solution that was in the flowers, she was hooked. So it didn't take her long to load up. And then she went back, and I don't know if you can see, the little black bars that are in here, that means when she's back in the hive. And my assistant radioed over to me, yep, she's dancing. And as you can see, within minutes, as soon as she got back to the hive, the number of other bees that were working that patch of flowers, that were starting to show up and work the flowers, shot up. It's shot up like a skyrocket. So this waggle dance works really well. It worked super well at 200 meters. When we repeated the experiment at greater distances, the same phenomenon happened. You wait a long time until one bee finds it, and there's no activity until the first bee finds it. But once the first bee finds it, boom, the colony can really send out a good, strong workforce to work it. The farther out it is, the slope of rise of the number of bees isn't as steep, because it's just everything takes longer when things are at greater distances. But still, it's a very powerful recruitment system. Any questions about this before we move from the waggle dance to the next signal? Yes?
On cloudy days, how do they orient?
On cloudy days, they have to memorize where the sun is in relation to landmarks. And that's something they learn when they're a young bee, when they start flying. They learn that if they were going out of the hive and they're doing their orientation flights in the morning, they memorize the sun's over that tree, or if they're doing it at midday. They actually have to build that up with experience.
So they also have to know what time it is when they leave.
Yeah, on a cloudy day they do.
On a cloudy day
Yes,
they do.
that's
How do
right,
they
that's
do
right.
that?
They've got a built-in clock. It's remarkable. We sort of have that too. You know, it's what wakes us up in the morning. It's what tells us to go to bed at night.
Is there a way of explaining, finding the source at 430 meters faster than at 200 meters?
That's a great point. I think that was just chance. But it may not have been entirely just chance, because once they discovered that this island wasn't just a dud place to live, that there were actually some flowers out there, I think there was more scouting on the subsequent days than there was initially.
Did they continue to come in large numbers after you moved the flowers?
Yeah, at the end of the first day, I would take the flowers away from that location, and I actually put them under a net, because I wanted to wait. This wasn't done the next day. It was a few days later. I wanted everything to settle down a little bit, and so the next morning they came out to that same location, but the flowers were gone, as if they had all disappeared. And in fact, they had. And so then at the 430 meter one, you can see I put it in a very different direction, not just a different direction, but a different distance, whole different location on the island. The island's not a large island, it's about 100 acres.
How long can they remember that location?
Oh, how long can it remember these locations? Can remember it for as long as it's alive, once it's learned it. And yeah, and people have done experiments where they've trained bees in the fall. Some of the winter bee, the long-line winter bee, learns a food source or a water source in the fall, and it will be coming out to that same location in the spring, as soon as it starts up.
So based on that theory, if you have a hive or nuke that got robbed or starting getting robbed, and they'll keep going to that same location to rob that colony,
Yeah.
so the best result will be to remove that completely to a different location.
Yep. Yeah, probably, good point, I'll repeat the question. The question is, so if you have a colony, if you have a hive that's been robbed out in the fall, if it's still left there, sitting there, open in the spring, it's going to again be robbed. It'll be quickly robbed because the robbers will still know about it. Yeah, definitely, you want to clean up that hive, get it under cover
Okay.
in the storage shed. Or put on top of another hive. Well, still at step one, the point I want to make here is that to muster additional nectar foragers is not simply a matter of doing waggle dances. There's another signal the bees use to do this, and it's very, very important. It's called the shaking signal. And it involves a bee, a successful forager, coming into the hive, grabbing other bees with her forelegs and shaking those other individuals. Let me show you a video of what the shaking signal looks like.
That's how my mother used to wake me up.
Yeah, this will look very familiar. She is. Grabs another bee, shakes her. Sometimes grabs her on the abdomen, sometimes on the thorax. I don't ever see him grab the head, but I'm sure that happens too.
Oh.
It lasts about better part of a second, each bout of shaking, and it's about a 15 hertz shaking frequency.
Can I ask a question?
You certainly may.
How is that different from the shaking signal when they swarm?
Let's see. When they swarm, they will also be doing the shaking signal to activate bees to go out and look for home sites. So it's functioning in the same way. I think, let me move on a little bit and you'll see it's really a parallel. Because just as they use the waggle dance in the house hunting process during swarming, they also use the shaking signal.
Okay,
Again, we'll get right there.
thank you.
Okay, this actually starts to get at your question. But it's a little different with the nest site because they're not foraging, they're scouting. But same kind of process. Why do these successful foragers produce these shaking signals? That's our question now. Well, it's because forager bees and nest site scouts, they go to sleep at night. And you might think, oh, and also in days of poor weather. And this saves the colony a lot of energy. And when I say sleep, I mean, that's not just a metaphor. It is physiologically sleep. The bee is immobile. Her body hangs limply. Here's some sleeping bees. There's a sleeping bee. The breathing rate slows, the body temperature drops, and resistance to disturbance increases. And even the brain activity changes. These bees are in a low energy, low metabolic state. They're resting. And thus it saves energy. And if you ever set up an observation hive, a glass-walled observation hive, and you look in at night, you'll see that the bees walking around on the brood nest in the center of the hive, they're mobile, they're active all night long. There's actually no rhythm to their rest and activity because their brood is being tended all around the clock. But the foragers, they're outside the brood nest, and they're standing there immobile. And that's also what happens on a rainy day. Those foragers, they go to the entrance, they discover there's no foraging to be done. They come back into the hive, and they go into this sort of sleep mode.
Could you explain what the last phrase means? I think I know, but I'm not sure.
Oh, it means, yeah, okay, good, thank you. Resistance to disturbance increases. This means that if you poke the bee, it doesn't respond. It's more resistant to being poked.
Okay.
And that's one of the criteria. These are some, actually, this may seem a little odd, but these are formal criteria for recognizing what sleep is. If you want to diagnose whether an animal is asleep or not, that's one of the criteria.
So it doesn't have anything to do with your hive is more irritable on a rainy day or not more irritable on a rainy day.
Yeah.
You're looking at a completely different issue.
Yeah, that's right, because
Okay.
when a colony is more defensive on a rainy day, that's the guard bees, not the foragers, that are responding with that greater defense. Yeah, if anything, these guys are out of action, relatively out of action. The reason they need, this is an activational signal. It's a wake-up signal. And being shaken wakes bees up. And the reason that a successful forager sometimes needs to produce the shaking signal is because if it's the start of the beginning of the day, especially after several days of bad weather, that bee, if she comes into the hive and does a waggle dance, it won't be very effective. And it won't be very effective because most of the other foragers are still asleep. Because for a waggle dance to be effective, she not only has to produce her signal, but she also has to have an audience. This bee is following this waggle dance. This bee is, this bee is, this bee is. But if the colony is quiet, has not had foraging activity for many hours or even a couple of days, there's a wake-up process that has to be done, and that's done with a shaking signal. Let me illustrate how these two signals, the shaking signal and the waggle dance, are produced by can be produced by the very same bee, but at different stages of the activational process. This was, well, here's the setup that was used in this experiment. I had trained bees for a purpose of an experiment I don't need to go into, to come out to a dish of sugar water that was 500 meters from the colony that was living in my observation hive. And the bees that were visiting the feeder were given labels with a dot of paint on the thorax and the abdomen. And we had been doing our experiments for several days, and then we got socked in by 3 days of rainy weather. So there was just no foraging for 3 days. Then on the 4th day, it was beautiful weather, kind of like today. And it was sunny, it was nice, and we had all the bees labeled. So I was sitting at the feeder waiting for the first bee to come. And a little after late, it was still chilly and a little bit chilly, but around 9 o'clock, the first bee showed up, and I reported into my walkie-talkie to my assistant, who was back at the observation. I said, "Red thorax is here. I think we're going to finally get going again. And I'll let you know when she leaves the feeder." So I call in, "Okay, red thorax is is coming back to the hive. I bet she's going to be, and she drank up the food very vigorously. I bet she's going to really do lots and lots of waggle dances. And we'll get this show back on the road. Then my assistant, about a minute later, says, yeah, Red Thorax has come in, but Tom, she's not doing a waggle dance. She's walking around grabbing the other bees and shaking them. And I said, okay, start counting. Let's follow this. This was a surprise to me. So I said, start counting how many bees she shakes. And that person started doing that. And this shows for each trip back into the hive. The first one was about at 9 o'clock. If this horizontal bar is black, that's a count of how many shaking signals produced. If it's a white bar, the white portion of each bar indicates how many waggle dance circuits she produced. So you can see for the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth trips back to the hive. So almost till 10 o'clock, the first hour or more, every time she came back with a load of nectar, she didn't do any waggle dances. She just went around and shook other bees. And then she started mixing shakings with wagglings. And then eventually, after late in the morning, she switched over to just doing waggle dances. So somehow that bee knew, and she came in the hive, and probably she sensed just how quiet it was in the hive in some way, that she needed to do this activational shaking before it made sense to start doing the waggles. Isn't that neat? The flexibility.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to know quite what told her that things are a little quiet in here. We need to.
Maybe she's getting tired.
Yeah.
Wanted help.
Yeah. She would get unloaded. Bees would take her food, but somehow she sensed that wasn't quite the right time to start doing the waggles. So we call this, I like to think of this as the shake and wake signal. We'll come back to that.
Do the food stores also sleep?
I think the food stores do also sleep, but probably not as much. And that's a really, I'm glad you asked that question actually, because these food store bees, I don't want to give you the impression that a food store bee is just a food store bee. Food store bees are these middle-aged bees, and you probably know that they're very versatile in the jobs that they can do. They're the bees that guard the nest. They're the bees that build the wax and the combs. They're the bees that pack the pollen. They're the bees that will clean up after a bee emerges out of a cell. They're the bees that come along and take the cappings wax and put it in a neat little rim at the mouth of the cell. They do almost everything except the nursing activities. They don't tend the queen, but they're very flexible. So even on a rainy day, they're putzing around inside the hive, getting things cleaned up, so they're active. So I don't think they're quieter, but because there's not a lot of nectar to process during a rainy day or at night, but they've got other jobs they can do. Yes?
Does a nurse bee or a forager bee remain that for their entire life cycle?
No, it's just a phase of life. Sorry, yeah. Is a nurse bee and a forager bee, are those fixed job assignments? No. They are, those are different stages of life. Rough rule, first 10 days you're functioning as a nurse bee. Second 10 days of life, 10 to 20, you're one of these middle-aged bees that's a food store, a comb builder, hive cleaner, guard bee. And the last 10 plus days you're a forager. It's called age polyethism, changing behavior with age. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes?
So that's where the forager bees come from, if there's a need for more nectar retrieval. The older storage bees become foragers?
Question is when a colony needs to activate more foragers, where do those foragers come from? Some of them do, most of them come from inactive foragers. There's a lot of bees, a lot of the elderly bees are sitting in reserve in the hive, waiting to be activated when flowers come into bloom, yielding nectar. But yes, there is, during a real strong honey flow, they mobilize so many foragers, they start to reach down into that middle-aged group and draw some out of the older middle-aged bees, pulling them into the foraging process. Yes?
So do we know why there would be the number of foragers called? I mean, if you've got this surplus amount,
Yeah.
what's the cutoff for what goes out?
What, yeah, okay, I'll repeat the question. What's the cutoff? How large a fraction of a colony's population can be mobilized in the foraging? The highest I've seen it go is about 50%. They can activate, normally under normal conditions, it goes up to maybe 30% or 35%. But if it's a real honey flow, they'll have at least 50% of the colony outside the hive. I've even seen it gone higher than that. And you've probably seen that yourself. If you open up a hive in the morning, before the foraging is active, it's kind of crowded in there. But in the afternoon, when there's a honey flow on, you open up that hive, it's a lot the combs are covered much more sparsely. A lot of those, most of it, even a majority of the bees can be outside working. Any other questions?
Is it like that for robbing also?
Is it like that from robbing? I don't know. I haven't really studied robbing closely. My sense is that it certainly could be, because when bees get robbing, they can have a real traffic of foragers. But I've never looked at that one. You know, robbing is a really understudied subject. I don't know. I'd love to look at that, but it's really hard to get a colony to rob another colony.
When you're watching it.
I know that may sound funny because it happens in the fall. You know, it's a danger we all face. But if you want to set up a colony, and I've tried this, you know, make a weak little colony in a hive that's stocked with honey. Even a weak colony can defend an entrance. I mean, and it's a vastly understudied. It's a great subject. Somebody needs to study it. Yes.
Humans have 4 sleep zones. What, do bees have different sleep zones?
Yeah, they go through phases of sleep. I'd have to go back. I don't know the answer to that. The question is, do humans have different phases of sleep, REM sleep, other stages of sleep? I believe bees share that with us as well, but I don't know the details. In the back there.
How much light is there in a hive? Are they dancing in the dark?
Yeah. How much light is there in a hive, and are they dancing in the dark? They're dancing in the dusk, because the dancing is done near the entrance, and there's actually a fair amount of light that comes in the entrance. But that said, they can communicate with the dance perfectly well if they are dancing in the dark. That's been tested experimentally. They don't need to see the other bee. They do need to feel the other bee and feel the air vibrations from the other bee. Okay, so we've looked at step 1, mobilizing additional nectar foragers when there's a lot of flowers in bloom. Now we're going to look at step 2, moving right along. We're going to look at how they increase the number of food stores so they can match the rate at which the nectar processing is kept matched with the rate at which nectar is being collected. Now, so how are they going to do this? Well, let's put an analogy here. Up along the coast of Maine, there used to be a big herring industry for making sardines. And it was a little bit, and the collection of the herring was changeable, and indeed unpredictable. It depended on when a big herring shoal was discovered and the boats went out and caught it. So there were herring factories, the sardine factories, would have boom and busts, and when they had herring to process to make sardines. And how did they deal with that situation? Well, what they had to do was they had to mobilize the people that would do the packing of the sardines when they had a big catch of sardines. And these were mostly women. They would come, and they would come down to the factory, and they'd gut each herring and cut off the head and put it in a can with some mustard often, and then seal up the can. But the question is, how did they mobilize? How did these packers know when to, the people that were going to do the packing, how did they know when they should report to the factory? The factories had a whistle. Each factory had a whistle. And when a boat came in with a good load of herring to be made into sardines. The factory whistle went off, and that called more workers. So the foragers are like the fishermen out there bringing back the herring, and the food store bees were like the women that were working in the factory doing the packing. And they called, when there was more of this going on, the whistle went off, and the workers doing the processing were called. Do the bees have a whistle in their hive to call up more bees to function as food stores? Do the foragers have a whistle to announce that we need more food stores? There's a lot of food out there. They do. And this is another signal. It's a third activational signal, and it's produced only by successful nectar foragers. It's not part of the pollen foraging process, because pollen, as we've talked about already, there isn't this pass-off process, this unloading process. Each pollen forager dumps the pollen in the cell herself. But they do have this tremble dance for organizing and keeping the nectar collection process running smoothly, the honey production process running smoothly. Let's look at a video of what this, you're probably dying to know what this tremble dance looks like. So let's look at it. It's pretty cool. Some of you have seen it already. But here's a tremble dancer. It's aptly named, isn't it? She's trembling. In fact, she looks a little, well, I like to say spastic. Maybe that's not the correct word. And you can see that other bees are paying attention to her. That bee's looking at her. This bee's checking her out. That bee is. This bee is. That bee is. You want to watch it again?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Okay, what word would you use?
Spastic's good.
Spastic. Some people say neurotic.
Be careful with that one.
Yeah, I know. Gotta be careful. Here's another tremble dancer down here, I think. But that's the.
I want to see it next to one of the waggle dancers. So it's not directional.
It's right. Very good. It's not directional. She's twisting. She's turning. What is she doing? She's shaking her body laterally back and forth. She's not going through a nice figure-8 motion. But she is walking across the comb a little bit. One more time.
So that's the difference sort of between the waggle dance and the
Yeah,
tremble?
there's no figure-8 motion.
Right.
She keeps just waggling and waggling,
Yeah.
trembling, trembling, trembling. There's no waggle phase followed by a return phase and then another waggle. But she does walk around a little bit, but it's not in that nice figure-8 motion. And this bee, with a waggle dance, it usually goes on for a minute or two. This can go on for a long time, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, sometimes even 60 minutes. This is a long-term signal.
And what are they saying?
What are they saying? Great question.
Go to work.
Yeah, they are saying we need more bees to function as food store bees. Because the bees that are producing this, as I'll explain shortly, are nectar foragers that have had experienced a great ease in collecting a nectar load. They've come into the hive, but they've had trouble finding anybody to take their food, to take their nectar. Now, I want to give you a little bit of history on this signal, because this is important. Yeah, question?
I just wanted to ask whether it's of any significance that all the bees in the last film seemed to be marked the same way, as if she were dancing, trembling among her peers. They were all gathered around her.
Yeah, all the bees in that hive are labeled.
They're all labeled the same way, so it doesn't make any difference.
Well, they're labeled in the same way, but it's an old video. It's a little hard to see, but each bee is individually identifiable in that.
My other question is whether that's your assistant.
No, this is not my assistant.
No, the assistant.
I'll show you one of my assistants shortly. This gentleman is Carl von Frisch. He's my mentor. He's my hero. He was a scientist. He was born in 1895, I think. Passed on in 1982. He was the person that deciphered the waggle dance. Very famous Austrian zoologist. And he was the first person to give a scientific description of the tremble dance. And I've translated his early German description into English, and it reads as, "At times one sees a strange behavior by bees who have returned home from a sugar water feeder or other goal. It is as if they had suddenly acquired the disease St. Vitus's dance." This is Korea. It's produced by an infection. It's not a neurodegenerative disease. It's a product of an infection that affects the nervous system. But he didn't know what it was. He reported it in 1923, and he couldn't figure it out. And then he went on to decipher the waggle dance. He noticed it when he was studying the waggle dance back in the 20s. The next time he wrote about it was over 40 years later, when he was writing his summary work of his life's work about the waggle dance. And he wrote, "I think the treble dance, tells the other bees nothing. It's perhaps comparable to the condition that Florey, 1954, has described as a neurosis." It does look kind of like a neurotic bee. And so he didn't solve it. And in fact, he said, he wrote, "If anybody can figure out what this dance is, I'll give him a prize." And alas, though, and so its function remained a mystery for nearly 40 years. And we say its function remained a mystery, or its message remained a mystery. It's because nobody was able to figure out what that bee had experienced to trigger her, or to stimulate her to make that signal. It was known that it was a forager, but what did that forager who was doing a treble dance, what did she experience that caused her to do a treble dance and not do a waggle dance, or not do a shaking signal? That was the mystery. Question. Yes?
Do all bees of the same age have the same work ethic, or are there lazy bees and more work ethic?
Let me ask you a question. Where's this question coming from? There's considerable variation. Some bees work harder than others, and we may come back to that. It has a lot to do with who your father is. If you're a bee. Wow. There are some patrolines where bees do work harder than others, particularly in the context of foraging. And there are some bees that not only work, it affects not only the variation in foraging labor, but those bees that might not be really good foragers could be really good at comb builders. There's a kind of division of labor to which they're genetically predisposed. Yes? Here.
Out of the three dances, are there individual audible sounds that they make?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Question.
Question is, are there sounds, are there distinct sounds associated with these dances? Yes, there are. Not the shaking signal. That signal is detected by the bee that's getting shaken, just by her body being shaken. But the waggle dancer, as she's doing her waggle phase, she's vibrating her wings, and she's making a little sound that is audible to other bees and attracts those bees to her, and that they can listen to how long that's how they actually know how long the waggle phase lasts. It's by how long she's beeping along there. It's making this little piping sound. In this case, with this treble dance, generally there's not a sound, but occasionally there is, and we'll come back to that, because it's a fourth signal that we're going to talk about today. Sometimes they'll make...
Sound? Is it a vocalization, or
He'll
is it
sing.
beating the wings, or?
Yeah, thank you, Keith. The sound is produced by vibrating the flight muscles in the thorax, which causes the wings to vibrate, and that makes an air vibration. Not through the mouth. We vibrate vocal cords, they vibrate wings. Any other questions?
Did Carl von Fisk receive a Nobel Prize?
Yes, he received the Nobel Prize in 1974, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the deciphering of the waggle dance.
But he described it in 23.
He described it in 23, but he didn't know, he misinterpreted it back in 1923. He thought it was just an activational signal. It wasn't until 1945 that he realized that these little bees are able to indicate the location, the specific location, by communicating the direction and distance to the food source. And that was a striking discovery, because up to that point, there was only one other species that was known to have that ability to say, if you want to find some good food source, go to this particular location. Now, what species would that be? Us, right. So people were blown away that a little bug had the ability to indicate, oh, go over in that direction at that distance and you'll find some food. People had long known that ants could lead the way, but this is an abstract way of saying go to that location. Not by leading the individual there, but just by giving them the information to find it. It's more like us saying, well, I know of a good restaurant, go to this street in that place. Anyhow, okay, moving on. Function of the tremble dance remained a mystery for nearly 70 years. The mystery was solved unexpectedly in the summer of 1990. And here's where the mystery was solved. It's at this Cranberry Lake Biological Station up in the Adirondack Park in northern New York State. This is a huge park. It's millions I think it's like 4 million acres, or square miles. It's big. It's really big. And it's heavily forested. And at this biological station, on this Cranberry Lake, it's surrounded by forest. The nearest flowers where bees can actually get forage are about 15 miles away. So I could take a colony of bees I use this as another experimental site, because I can take a colony of bees here, and because there are no natural food sources, the artificial food sources that I provide are it for the bees. So I have control over the food sources for the bees. So I was working there one summer and doing an experiment on the regulation of the waggle dance. I was focused on better understanding how they adjust their waggle dance activity, because we had known that when there's a dearth of nectar, the waggle dancers will dance for almost anything. Beggars can't be choosers. But when there's more nectar coming into the hive, we knew that bees are much more selective about what they will advertise with the waggle dance, because now they've got riches to choose among. So you should be picky about what you dance for. But what was unclear was how the bees know whether there's little nectar coming into the hive or a lot of nectar coming into the hive. So I was working there in the summer of 1990 doing an experiment that would address that question. I wanted to know that if a nectar forager is inhibited from waggle dancing, if she experiences difficulty finding a food store bee to take her load. Because I reasoned, if there's a lot of nectar available, if there's a honey flow on, then there's going to be a lot of nectar coming into the hive, and so it'd be like a lot of customers coming into the checkout line in a grocery store. I thought, maybe if there's a lot of nectar coming in, bees have a harder time finding a food store bee, and they have to wait longer. And so I decided to test that hypothesis by doing the following experiment. I went to Cranberry Lake with my observation hive. I went there with an assistant, actually 2 assistants. And the bees were trained. The observation hive is in this building. She's sitting by a little table with that sugar water feeder that we've looked at already. And every time a bee bees would be trained to come out to that feeder, and then each bee would be labeled. That's not one of the bees from that experiment, but it shows the labeling process, as we've seen already. So bees were trained to that feeder. Each bee that came to the feeder was labeled for individual identification. And by having those bees go into the feeder label, that enabled me to label all the food stores in the hive. Because every time one of the bees returned from the feeder and was regurgitating nectar, I could see the bee that was receiving that was taking the nectar from her, that was the receiver bee, the food store bee, and I could put a dot of paint on her back. And I could do that because my observation hive had a window here, and this is where the unloading is done. And so if I see a bee unloading, one of the bees coming in the hive from the feeder, she'd get labeled with yellow. And then at the end of the day, and this is where the experimental manipulation came in, I opened up the hive and I removed all the food store bees. And this would make it very hard for bees coming back from the feeder the next morning to get unloaded. Even though there's no honey flow on, I would create a situation as if there were a honey flow on by making it hard for a returning forager to get unloaded. And I wanted to see if that manipulation, making it hard to get unloaded, even when there's not a honey flow on, would cause bees to be reluctant to produce waggle dances. And what I found, so the question is, would a forager bees be discouraged from dancing if they had trouble getting unloaded? What I found was this. The effects of the removal of the food store bees were that, indeed, these returning nectar foragers did have trouble getting unloaded. They did stop waggle dancing, and, to my surprise, they began tremble dancing. And I had seen tremble dances before, but like von Frisch, I thought, what would that be? Why is that bee doing that? But now I had suddenly, inadvertently, unintentionally, created a situation where I could turn on the tremble dancing. So now I knew what that bee had experienced, which evidently had caused her to stop waggle dancing and do the tremble dancing instead. I had made it very hard for her to get unloaded. Curiously, that situation only lasted about an hour. And that was also revealing to me. Because while I was seeing these bees walking around doing these tremble dances, after about an hour, the returning foragers didn't have much difficulty getting unloaded. And that suggested to me, too, that, hey, not only do I have a hunch about what's turning on the tremble dance, but I'm also getting a hunch about what the effect of the tremble dance is. It's activating more bees. Because I had removed all the food store bees, but they were somehow activating more bees to function as food stores. You might wonder how many food store bees I removed in that experiment. It was about 800. The colony had about 4,000 bees in the observation hive. But they obviously had reserves. I took out those 800, but there were still middle-aged bees in there that could be called up.
One at a time, you'd open the window, see one that grab him, put a yellow on him, put him back till that night?
I didn't have to, no, let me go back. Thank you for asking that question. I didn't have to
What was
open
the
up.
question?
The question is, what's this labeling? How did this labeling process work? The labeling process was all day long. I had bees coming in from the feeder out in the field. They would come in with their load of nectar. I'd watch one come in. I'd follow her as she walked up onto the comb. And as soon as as soon as another bee met her and started to take her nectar, I didn't have to open up the hive. The hive had an opening here. I could just put a dot of paint on the back of the bee that was with her tongue out that was receiving the food. And I did that all day long. And eventually, by the end of the day, I knew I was successful because every bee that I saw receiving nectar had already been labeled. That told me that I had everybody labeled. And then once it became dark and the whole process shut down, then I did take the whole hive, I did take the glass off both sides, and then I plucked off, one by one, I'd pick up each bee that had been labeled with a dot of yellow paint, a bee that had been a nectar receiver. I would pick her up by the wings and put her in a cage, and I just did that over and over again till I removed all of the many hundreds of bees that had been functioning as the receiver bees, the food store bees. And then I closed up the hive, and then the next morning, so everything is the same in that hive except that it's missing the bees that had been the food stores the previous day. I didn't remove any of the nectar foragers, just those 800 or so bees that had been the food stores. And then it was the next day, the little nectar foragers, they didn't know it, nobody had bothered them, so they went out to the feeder. They loaded up, they came home, and then they had trouble finding somebody to take them.
So then they tremble danced.
And then they were doing tremble dances like crazy. In fact, this whole area of the hive, because initially there was nobody taking the food. It was just a flurry of frustrated tremble dancing